Culture is shaped by the choices we consistently make. Every single day, whether we recognize it or not, we are participating in the building of an atmosphere, a system, a rhythm of life that will influence not only us, but everyone connected to us. It is never just about one choice made in isolation. It is about the repetition of choices that begin to form patterns. And those patterns become identity. You cannot separate culture from choice, because culture is the visible manifestation of what a people have chosen to repeat. When you walk into a family, into an organization, into a nation, what you are encountering is not random. It is the fruit of generations of consistent choices. When we understand this, we begin to recognize that culture is not just about the music we hear, or the clothes we wear, or the language we speak. Those are surface expressions. The real foundation of culture is the unseen decisions, the invisible agreements, the habits that no one applauds but everyone participates in. Culture is created in the daily choices that look small in the moment, but over time build something massive and lasting. If we want to shift culture, if we want to shape culture, we cannot just focus on the big statements or the loud declarations. We must focus on the daily decisions that accumulate power. This is why what you choose today matters. Because your choices are not isolated, they are seeds. A seed looks small, almost insignificant, but when planted and nurtured consistently, it becomes a tree that others can see, touch, and benefit from. Your consistent choices are like seeds that grow into trees, and when many trees grow together, they create a forest, and that forest is the culture. So when you choose faith over fear, when you choose truth over compromise, when you choose love over hate, you are not just making a moral decision for yourself. You are planting seeds that over time will create a culture of faith, of truth, of love that others will inherit. Consider how family culture is created. A child grows up watching their parents. If the parents consistently choose patience, respect, honesty, those choices form the environment the child breathes in. The child doesn't need a lecture about values every single day, because the culture has already been shaped by the repeated choices of the parents. Likewise, if parents consistently choose anger, dishonesty, neglect, that too becomes the culture. And the child will often carry that culture forward into their own family, unless they make the courageous decision to disrupt it. That is the power of consistent choices. They not only shape your present, they shape your future and the future of those who come after you. Every society we look at is built on consistent choices. Why do certain nations value punctuality, while others seem more relaxed about time? Why do some cultures emphasize community while others emphasize individuality? It is not an accident. It is the result of consistent choices made over time that became identity. What started as choices became expectations. What became expectations turned into traditions, and what became traditions turned into culture. So if culture is formed by repetition, then we must ask ourselves, what are we repeating without even realizing it? Sometimes we underestimate the power of repetition because we crave the dramatic moment, the big decision, the loud breakthrough. But culture is not usually formed in one dramatic moment. It is formed in the quiet repetition of everyday choices. Think about exercise. One workout does not transform your body, but consistent exercise does. One healthy meal does not change your health, but consistently choosing healthy meals will. In the same way, one act of kindness does not create a culture of compassion, but consistent acts of kindness will. One prayer does not create a culture of faith, but consistent prayer does. What you do once may be impressive, but what you do consistently becomes culture. When Jesus walked the earth, his miracles were powerful, but even more powerful was his consistency. He consistently chose compassion, consistently chose obedience to the Father, consistently chose truth, even when it offended the religious leaders, consistently withdrew to pray, even when crowds demanded his attention. That consistency created a culture of the kingdom that we are still living under today. The Sermon on the Mount was not just a speech, it was a cultural blueprint. Every consistent choice Jesus made was building a kingdom culture that continues to disrupt and redefine the world thousands of years later. Your life is doing the same thing. Every choice you make is either reinforcing the culture of heaven or the culture of this world. There is no neutral ground. The enemy knows this, which is why he fights so hard to disrupt your consistency. He knows that if you pray once, you may feel encouraged, but if you pray consistently, you will build a culture of prayer that cannot be shaken. He knows that if you give once, you may bless someone, but if you give consistently, you will create a culture of generosity that multiplies. He knows that if you forgive once, it may bring peace, but if you forgive consistently, you will create a culture that breaks cycles of bitterness and generational pain. That is why his strategy is not only temptation, but also distraction and discouragement, because he wants to break your rhythm, to keep you from repeating the very choices that would build kingdom culture in your life. We often think culture is changed by loud revolutions, but more often it is changed by silent revolutions of consistent choices. A person who consistently walks in integrity is a quiet revolution in a world that normalizes compromise. A person who consistently treats others with dignity is a revolution in a culture that thrives on exploitation. A person who consistently pursues excellence is a revolution in a culture that celebrates mediocrity. And when enough people choose consistency in the right direction, it becomes contagious, and what was once a countercultural choice becomes the new culture. Your consistent choices also teach people what to expect from you. If you consistently tell the truth, people expect honesty from you, and honesty becomes the culture of your relationships. If you consistently show up on time, people expect reliability, and reliability becomes the culture of your work. If you consistently encourage others, people expect positivity, and encouragement becomes the culture of your community. But if you consistently complain, negativity becomes the culture. If you consistently gossip, distrust becomes the culture. If you consistently quit when things get hard, instability becomes the culture. That is why your choices are not just personal, they are cultural. People are being shaped by what you consistently choose. The truth is that consistency builds credibility, and credibility builds culture. It is not enough to declare what you believe if your choices contradict it. People are not shaped by what you say, they are shaped by what you repeatedly do. If you want to change the culture in your family, in your workplace, in your community, start by changing your consistent choices. It may feel small, it may feel unnoticed, but over time it will bear fruit. Just as a tree grows silently before it bears fruit, culture grows silently before it becomes visible. This is why discipline is so important. Discipline is not punishment, discipline is training. Discipline allows you to choose consistently even when your feelings resist. Because feelings are temporary, but culture is lasting. If you only choose based on how you feel, you will never build culture. You will live in chaos. But when you choose based on conviction, you will build something steady, something strong, something lasting. Conviction is what empowers consistency. Conviction says, even when I don't feel like it, I will still pray, I will still forgive, I will still walk in integrity, I will still honor God. And that consistency creates culture. Think about Daniel in Babylon. He was surrounded by a culture that worshipped idols, that compromised truth, that sought to assimilate him. But Daniel made a consistent choice to pray 3 times a day, to honor God in what he ate, to walk in integrity. And his consistency shaped a new culture even in the middle of Babylon. He was so consistent that even his enemies knew where to find him. They knew he would be praying. His consistent choices created a culture of faith that not only preserved him, but influenced kings and nations. That is the power of consistent choices. They can shift culture even in the midst of opposition. Consistency is not glamorous. It is often hidden. It is often repetitive. It is often uncelebrated. But it is powerful. The enemy wants you to despise the day of small beginnings. But God says do not despise it, because it is in the small, consistent steps that the culture of the kingdom is established. Culture is not built overnight, it is built over time. And time always tells the truth what you consistently chose. You may wonder why certain cycles keep repeating in your life or your family. The answer is often found in consistent choices. If generations consistently chose silence over confrontation, then a culture of avoidance was built. If generations consistently chose fear over faith, then a culture of limitation was built. But the good news is that you can disrupt it. You can be the one who makes a different, consistent choice. You may not be able to change the choices of the past, but you can make consistent choices today that will reshape the future. This is the power of legacy. Legacy is not built by what you do once. It is built by what you do consistently. When you think of the people who impacted your life the most, it was not because of one big moment. It was because of their consistent presence, consistent love, consistent encouragement, consistent faith. That consistency created culture in you. And now you carry that culture forward. You are shaping culture right now. Every choice you make is either reinforcing a culture of faith or a culture of fear, a culture of love or a culture of hate, a culture of truth or a culture of lies, a culture of generosity or a culture of greed. You may feel like your choices are small, but they are shaping the atmosphere around you. They are teaching people what to expect. They are building patterns that others will either embrace or resist. You have more power than you realize because consistency is not just about you. It is about culture. Transformation requires disrupting unhealthy patterns. We often desire change. We pray for change. We speak about change. Yet what holds many people hostage is not the absence of desire, but the presence of patterns. Patterns are invisible chains. They are the cycles that keep us returning to the same behaviors, the same relationships, the same limitations, no matter how much we declare that we want something different. To experience true transformation, we must recognize that it cannot come by simply wishing for a new reality. It requires disrupting the old rhythms that have kept us bound. A pattern that is unhealthy does not break itself. It must be confronted, disrupted, and replaced with something new. Patterns are powerful because they are familiar. Even when unhealthy, they provide a sense of comfort because they are predictable. Our brains are emotions. Our habits adapt to familiarity. We repeat what feels safe even when it destroys us because it feels known. This is why transformation often feels uncomfortable at first. It requires stepping into the unknown. Disrupting unhealthy patterns feels like tearing apart the ground beneath your feet, but unless that ground is broken, you cannot plant new seeds. Transformation demands a disruption because you cannot build a new life on the same old foundations. When you look at your life, you will see evidence of patterns everywhere. The way you respond to stress, the way you choose relationships, the way you manage conflict, the way you view yourself, all of it is shaped by repeated behaviors and choices. If those behaviors are rooted in fear, insecurity, or trauma, then the pattern will consistently lead you back to pain. This is why someone can leave a toxic relationship only to find themselves in another that looks different on the surface, but feels the same underneath. Because until the pattern is disrupted, the fruit will remain the same. Transformation cannot happen if you simply change the scenery but keep the same cycle alive. God is always calling us higher, but stepping into the new always requires letting go of the old. The Israelites longed for freedom. They prayed for deliverance, and God answered. Yet when they found themselves in the wilderness, their patterns began to speak louder than their prayers. They had been enslaved for so long that bondage had become their rhythm. When faced with discomfort, they longed to go back to Egypt, not because Egypt was good, but because Egypt was familiar. That is the power of patterns. They can make you crave captivity simply because it feels predictable. Transformation requires disrupting that voice inside that says it's safer to stay the same. Unhealthy patterns are often generational. They're not just what you do, they are what you inherit. Families pass down cycles of fear, anger, secrecy, dysfunction, brokenness, and unless someone disrupts it, the pattern becomes the inheritance of every generation. But the good news is that transformation is not only possible, it is promised when you choose to confront what has been normalized. You may have come from a family where no one knew how to express love, but you can be the one who disrupts that pattern by consistently choosing vulnerability and affection. You may have come from a lineage of addiction, but you can disrupt that pattern by surrendering your weakness to God and choosing a new rhythm of freedom. You may have grown up in an environment of scarcity, but you can disrupt that by walking in generosity and faith. Transformation requires someone bold enough to say, "It stops with me." What we often overlook is that disruption is not always dramatic. It is daily. It is not always a moment of shouting or breaking away. Sometimes it is the quiet, consistent choice to no longer respond the way you used to. If your pattern was anger, disruption might look like pausing before you speak, choosing patience instead of rage until a new rhythm is built. If your pattern was fear, disruption might look like taking one small step of faith each day until courage becomes natural. If your pattern was shame, disruption might look like speaking truth over yourself until your mind begins to agree with God's word. Transformation does not happen by accident, it happens by intention. And intention requires disrupting the old ways on purpose. The enemy thrives on patterns. He does not need to invent a new strategy for your life if he knows you will keep repeating the same one that already works. He knows your triggers, he knows your defaults, and he relies on your agreement with unhealthy cycles to keep you stuck. That is why spiritual warfare is often about breaking patterns. It is not only about casting down a thought once, it is about refusing to entertain the thought every single time it comes until its power is broken. It is not just about resisting temptation once. It is about disrupting the temptation every time until your pattern is no longer weakness, but strength. Transformation happens when the weapons that used to work against you no longer have access to you because the pattern they once attached to has been dismantled. Consider how Jesus healed people. He did not only deal with the surface issue, he disrupted the underlying pattern. When he healed the man at the pool of Bethesda, he did not just say, "Get up and walk." He also told him to pick up his mat and leave. Why? Because the mat represented his old pattern, his comfort zone, his identity tied to limitation. If he had walked but left his mat behind, he might have been tempted to return to it when life felt difficult. Jesus disrupted not only his paralysis, but the entire pattern of how he lived. That is transformation. It is not about temporary change. It is about dismantling the systems that keep you bound. Disruption feels costly because it requires letting go of what has become normal. If your normal is dysfunction, disrupting it will feel like loss. If your normal is chaos, disrupting it will feel like silence that seems unbearable at first. If your normal is settling for less, disrupting it will feel like risk. But you cannot embrace transformation without releasing what has become familiar. Sometimes God will allow your comfort to be shaken, your plans to be interrupted, your environment to shift drastically, not because he wants to harm you, but because he is disrupting the pattern that has kept you small. You prayed for transformation, but transformation often arrives in the form of disruption. We see this in scripture repeatedly. Abram could not become Abraham until he left his father's house and the familiar land he knew. That was a disruption. The disciples could not become apostles until they left their nets and followed Jesus. That was a disruption. Saul could not become Paul until his entire pattern of persecuting Christians was disrupted on the road to Damascus. Every story of transformation carries a story of disruption, and the same is true for you. You cannot enter into the fullness of your calling without allowing God to disrupt the patterns that have limited your capacity. Unhealthy patterns often masquerade as personality. You say, "That's just who I am. That's how I respond. That's just how my family is." But the truth is, it is not personality, it is a pattern. And as long as you identify with the pattern, you will excuse it instead of confronting it. Transformation requires you to tell yourself the truth. You cannot heal what you are unwilling to name. If you call dysfunction normal, you will protect it. But if you call it what it is, you can disrupt it. This is why revelation is so important. Revelation shines light on the patterns that have been hiding in the dark. When light comes, you see what you could not see before. And in that moment, you have the opportunity to disrupt it. Disruption is rarely applauded. People who are comfortable in the old pattern will resist anyone who dares to challenge it. When you choose to break cycles in your family, some may criticize you because your choices expose their comfort with dysfunction. When you choose to pursue purity in a culture that normalizes compromise, some will mock you because your disruption threatens their excuses. When you choose to walk in excellence in a culture that celebrates mediocrity, some will resent you because your consistency highlights their inconsistency. But transformation has never been about pleasing people. It has always been about aligning with God's purpose. And when you align with Him, even if people resist you at first, your disruption will speak louder than their resistance. Disruption requires courage. It requires the willingness to be uncomfortable, to be misunderstood, to be stretched beyond what is familiar. But courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite fear. When you disrupt an unhealthy pattern, you will feel resistance from within and without. Your mind will try to pull you back into what it knows. People will try to remind you of who you used to be. The enemy will try to tempt you with what you left behind. But transformation requires you to keep moving forward, to keep choosing differently until the new pattern is established. Think about Joseph. His brothers betrayed him, sold him, lied on him, threw him in prison. Yet when he rose to power and had the chance to retaliate, he disrupted the pattern of revenge. Instead of repeating bitterness, he chose forgiveness. And that choice did not just transform him. It transformed his family. It preserved a nation. It fulfilled a prophetic destiny. If he had repeated the unhealthy pattern of vengeance, the story would have ended in destruction. But because he disrupted it, the story became one of redemption. Transformation always requires someone willing to disrupt what everyone else assumes must continue. Transformation is not instant, but it begins in a moment. The moment you decide that the old pattern no longer has authority over your life is the moment transformation begins. The pattern may not disappear overnight, but your agreement with it is broken. And as you continue to disrupt it consistently, a new rhythm will form. What used to feel natural will begin to feel foreign, and what used to feel foreign will begin to feel natural. That is how transformation takes root, not by one dramatic act alone, but by daily disruption until a new culture is formed. When we talk about culture, we often think of it as something that just exists around us, something we are born into, something that simply is. But what I have come to understand is that culture is not just an atmosphere we step into. It is a force that is being created and recreated every single day. And at the heart of it is influence. At the center of it is the way one person's conviction, one person's choice, one person's voice can shape what others come to believe is normal, acceptable, beautiful, or powerful. And when we say that culture is influenced by the loudest voices, we are not just talking about volume in the natural sense. We are talking about the persistence of those voices, the ones that refuse to be silenced, the ones that repeat themselves until even those who once disagreed start to adjust, the ones that echo so loudly in the halls of society that silence itself feels like agreement. You see, influence is not always rooted in truth. Influence is not always rooted in righteousness, but it is always rooted in consistency and confidence. Because if you say something long enough, if you present it bold enough, if you package it in a way that feels undeniable, people begin to adapt to it, even if at first they wrestled with it. And this is why culture shifts not necessarily by what is right or wrong, but by what is loud and what is visible. And this is where we are confronted with the responsibility to recognize that silence is not neutral. Because when the voices that do not carry truth are the only voices being heard, then deception becomes the language of the culture, and what God has called good can be dismissed as irrelevant, while what God calls broken is celebrated as freedom. This is why we cannot underestimate the weight of influence, because what you lend your voice to, what you amplify, what you normalize becomes the very thing that others will begin to shape their identities around. And you might think, well, I am just one person. What does my voice matter in a sea of millions? But if there is anything history has taught us, it is that movements do not begin with the masses. They begin with one person who dared to stand up, one person who refused to bow to the pressures of silence, one person who decided that if the loudest voices in the room were distorting truth, then their voice, no matter how small it seemed, could disrupt the pattern and introduce something that awakens hearts to remember who they are. The reality is, influence does not require a stage. It does not require a microphone. It does not require a crowd of thousands. Influence begins in the smallest conversations, in the everyday decisions, in the way you live your life in front of others, because people are always watching, even when you do not realize it. And what they see in you will either reinforce the noise of the culture around them or remind them that there is another way, a higher way, a way that calls them back to alignment with truth. And the more you live with that conviction, the more your voice, your example, your presence begins to resound louder than you could have imagined. We have to understand that the culture is not shifted by what is whispered once. It is shifted by what is declared over and over. And this is why propaganda works. This is why marketing works. This is why repetition is such a powerful tool. Because the human mind is wired to adapt to what it hears consistently. And when lies are repeated consistently, they start to sound like truth. But when truth is repeated consistently, when it is declared without shame, when it is lived without compromise, then it begins to dismantle the lies. It begins to pierce through the fog of confusion. It begins to remind people that there is something unshakable, something eternal, something that does not bend with the winds of opinion. And so the loudest voices do not have to be the majority. They simply have to be the most persistent. And that persistence builds a momentum that shifts atmospheres. And what God is calling us to recognize is that if we do not take our place as voices of truth, if we shrink back in the face of opposition, then the voices that are loud will dictate the norms of culture, and generations will be shaped by what they hear, because children grow up believing that whatever is celebrated must be right, and whatever is silenced must be wrong. But when voices of righteousness rise, when they dare to be loud, when they dare to stand, when they dare to embody the truth unapologetically, then culture begins to shift in alignment with the kingdom of God, you see. When Jesus walked the earth, he was one voice, and yet his voice disrupted systems. His voice challenged traditions. His voice carried such authority that crowds gathered just to hear him. And even those who opposed him could not ignore him. Because his presence demanded attention, his words carried a weight that pierced through the noise. And this is the model we have been given. Not that we need to gather the most followers, not that we need to trend on every platform, but that our voice, rooted in truth, empowered by the Spirit of God, will carry a weight that no culture, no system, no deception can drown out. The disciples were not the most educated. They were not the most influential in the eyes of society, but their voices, their testimonies, their convictions were so loud in their consistency that entire nations were transformed. And what began as a small group of followers turned into a movement that outlived empires. And this is the evidence that culture does not belong to those with the biggest platforms alone. Culture belongs to those who refuse to let their voice be silenced, who refuse to let truth be buried, who refuse to let the noise of deception go unchallenged. And so the question becomes, what are the loudest voices in your life? What are the loudest voices in your family, in your community, in your workplace? Because those voices are shaping culture. And if you want to see a culture that reflects righteousness, if you want to see a culture that reflects love, justice, and truth, then you have to be willing to be a voice that speaks up, a voice that lives boldly, a voice that refuses to compromise. And the more we become aware of the weight of our influence, the more intentional we will be about how we use it. Because your silence is influence, your compromise is influence, your boldness is influence. And every moment you are shaping culture, whether you realize it or not. And this is why when we talk about the loudest voices, we have to recognize that the loudness is not always in decibels. It is in conviction. It is in consistency. It is in the refusal to retreat. And when your conviction is fueled by truth, when it is anchored in God, then your influence will not only echo in the culture of today, but it will echo into the culture of generations to come. When we speak about shaping and shifting culture, it is not enough to recognize that choices and voices matter. We also must come face to face with the power of narratives and stories, because culture is not only built on what people do, it is also built on what people believe. And belief is often born from the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell our children, the stories we repeat in our communities until they form the backdrop of how we see life. And if we truly desire to be agents of cultural transformation, then we must understand the depth of storytelling. Because stories do not just entertain. They imprint, they shape memory, they guide behavior, They normalize what might once have felt abnormal, and they silence what might once have felt undeniable. And in that way, stories are the bedrock of culture. Think about it. Every culture, every people group, every nation carries stories that define who they are. Stories of struggle, stories of victory, stories of pain, stories of promise, stories that teach children what to fear and what to honor, stories that explain why things are the way they are and why certain things must never be changed. And when those stories are retold across generations, they create a rhythm, a language, a framework that makes culture feel immovable. But the truth is, culture is never immovable. It is simply being maintained by the power of repeated stories. And once those stories are challenged, once new stories begin to rise, the culture itself begins to bend, to adapt, to evolve. The enemy understands this principle, which is why he has always sought to rewrite narratives. Because if you can change the story people believe about themselves, you can change how they live. If you can convince a generation that their worth is tied to how much they achieve, or how much they consume, or how perfectly they perform, then you have shaped a culture that values striving over rest, performance over authenticity, masks over truth. And if you can convince people that their identity is small, broken, limited, unworthy, then you have cultivated a culture of silence, shame, and fear, because people will live out the story they believe, and they will replicate that story in the choices they make and the lives they build. But God has always been in the business of rewriting stories, of redeeming narratives, of taking what was distorted and restoring it to truth. And if we are called to be participants in shaping culture, then our task is to amplify his story, to embody his narrative, to live in such a way that our lives become evidence that the old story is not the only story, that the lies that have been repeated do not have to remain the loudest, that there is another way to live, another way to see ourselves, another way to shape the future. And when we tell those stories, when we live those testimonies, when we declare them over and over, they begin to infiltrate the culture. They begin to challenge the strongholds of deception. They begin to awaken hearts to remember the truth that was buried under the noise. This is why testimonies are powerful, because your story is not just about you. Your story carries the power to shift culture. Because when you speak about how God had delivered you, how he healed you, how he restored you, how he opened doors you could not open, you are not just sharing an isolated moment. You are planting a seed in the mind of someone else. You are giving them a new narrative to hold on to. You are showing them that what they thought was impossible is possible. And when enough people begin to carry that story, it becomes a cultural shift. It becomes a new expectation. It becomes the new normal. Culture is always asking, what story will we agree upon? What story will we tell ourselves about who we are? And if we do not tell the story rooted in truth, then the culture will be built on lies. And lies repeated often enough become traditions. They become celebrated. They become passed down as wisdom, even though they were never wisdom to begin with. And so we are confronted with the responsibility of not just living differently, but telling it, declaring it, repeating it until the narrative of truth is louder than the narrative of deception. Look at how media has shaped culture in our time. Through movies, through television, through social media, stories are being told every single day. And those stories are influencing how people see love, how they see family, how they see identity, how they see success, how they see God. And it is not always what is said directly. It is often the subtle storytelling, the consistent messaging that frames the mind. And because people are consuming these stories daily, they begin to live according to them without even realizing they are being discipled by a narrative, discipled by a culture, discipled by a story that was designed to shape how they think, how they feel, how they act. And so the question is, what stories are we telling? What stories are we repeating? Because silence is not enough. Resistance is not enough. There must be a replacement. There must be a story of truth, a narrative of hope, a testimony of redemption that is told loudly, consistently, unapologetically, because the only way to displace a lie is to tell a better story. The only way to dethrone deception is to declare truth until it becomes undeniable. The only way to reshape culture is to retell the narrative until it becomes the foundation of how people see themselves and their world. This is why Jesus spoke in parables, because stories penetrate in ways arguments cannot. Stories bypass defenses. They reach the heart. They allow the listener to see themselves in the narrative, to imagine what life could look like from another perspective. And in doing so, they shift something in the mind, something in the spirit, something in the culture. And those parables have lasted generations. They have become more than lessons, they have become cultural anchors. Because the story is not just what happened, it is the truth it reveals. And truth wrapped in story becomes unforgettable. This is also why the enemy has sought to distort even biblical stories, to rewrite them in ways that strip them of power, to convince people that they are myths, that they are irrelevant, that they are outdated, because he knows that if you undermine the story, you undermine the culture it builds. But when you restore the story, when you remind people of what God has done, when you lift up the narrative of his faithfulness, then suddenly the culture begins to remember, to awaken, to realign with truth. And so, if you want to shape culture, you must take ownership of your story. You must stop hiding the very testimony that carries the power to liberate someone else. You must stop believing the lie that your story is insignificant, because what feels ordinary to you could be revolutionary to someone else. And when we collectively begin to share those stories, when we declare them without shame, when we repeat them with confidence, then suddenly the cultural narrative begins to change, because the atmosphere is filled with testimonies that silence the lies of the enemy. The reality is that culture is like a tapestry, woven together by the threads of stories. And if the enemy weaves his threads long enough, he creates a design that people accept as reality. But when we begin to weave in threads of truth, threads of light, threads of redemption, then the design begins to shift. The tapestry begins to reflect something new, something holy, something aligned with God. And once the image begins to change, people cannot unsee it. They cannot return to the lie as easily because the truth has been imprinted on their imagination. This is why movements that last are always tied to stories, because a movement without a story cannot sustain itself. People rally around a vision, but they are anchored by a narrative. They need to know where they came from, why they are fighting, what they are building. And if we want to sustain cultural change, we cannot just call for new actions. We must provide new narratives. We must tell the story of who we are becoming. We must give language to what God is doing. Because when people see themselves in a new story, they begin to live in a new way. And when enough people live in a new way, culture itself begins to transform. And this is where we realize that shaping culture is not simply about pointing out what is wrong. It is about offering a better story. It is about creating an imagination for what is possible. It is about painting a vision so compelling that people cannot help but align themselves with it. Because people do not just abandon lies, they need a truth to run toward. They need a story that is stronger, richer, more alive. And when you give them that story, they will let go of the old because the new feels like freedom. The new feels like life. The new feels like truth.